The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr., Chapter 15, To College in the Bluegrass. As the schoolmaster had foretold, there was no room at college for Jack. Several times Major Buford took the dog home with him, but Jack would not stay. Next morning, the dog would turn up at the door of the dormitory where Chad and the schoolmaster slept, and as a last resort, the boy had to send Jack home. So one Sunday morning, Chad led Jack out of the town for several miles, and at the top of a high hill pointed toward the mountains and sternly told him to go home. And Jack, understanding that the boy was in earnest, trotted sadly away with a placard around his neck. I own this dog. His name is Jack. He is on his way to Kingdom Come. Please feed him. Uncle Joel Turner will shoot any man who steals him. Chad. It was no little consolation to Chad to think that the faithful sheepdog would in no small measure repay the Turners for all they had done for him. But Jack was the closest link that bound him to the mountains, and dropping out of sight behind the crest of the hill, Chad crept to the top again and watched Jack until he trotted out of sight. And the link was broken. Then Chad went slowly and sorrowfully back to his room. It was the smallest room in the dormitory that the schoolmaster had chosen for himself and Chad, and in it were one closet, one table, one lamp, 2 chairs, and 1 bed. No more. There were 2 windows in the little room, one almost swept by the branches of a locust tree and overlooking the brown-gray sloping campus and the roofs and church steeples of the town, the other opening to the east on a sweep of field and woodland over which the sun rose with a daily message from the unseen mountains far beyond, and toward which Chad had sent Jack trotting home. It was a proud day for Chad when Caleb Hazel took him to matriculate, leading him from one to another of the professors who awed the lad with their preternatural dignity. But it was a sad blow when he was told that in everything but mathematics he must go to the preparatory department until the second session of the term, the kitchen, as it was called by the students. He bore it bravely, though, and the schoolmaster took him down the shady streets to the busy thoroughfare where the official bookstore was, and where Chad, with pure ecstasy, caught his first new books under one arm and trudged back, bending his head now and then to catch the delicious smell of the fresh leaves and print. It was while he was standing with his treasures under the big elm at the turnstile, looking across the campus at the sundown, that 2 boys came down the gravel path. He knew them both at once as Dan and Harry Dean. Both looked at him curiously, as he thought, but he saw that neither knew him, and no one spoke. The sound of wheels came up the street behind him just then, and a carriage halted at the turnstile to take them in. Turning, Chad saw a slender girl with dark hair and eyes, and heard her call brightly to the boys. He almost caught his breath at the sound of her voice, but he kept sturdily on his way, and the girl's laugh rang in his ears as it rang the first time he heard it, was ringing when he reached his room, ringing when he went to bed that night and lay sleepless, looking through his window at the quiet stars. For some time, indeed, no one recognized him, and Chad was glad. Once he met Richard Hunt riding with Margaret, and the piercing dark eyes that the boy remembered so well turned again to look at him. Chad colored and bravely met them with his own, but there was no recognition. And he saw John Morgan, Captain John Morgan, at the head of the Lexington Rifles, which he had just formed from the best blood of the town, as though in long preparation for that coming war. Saw him and Richard Hunt as lieutenant, drilling them in the campus, and the sight thrilled him as nothing else except Margaret had ever done. Many times he met the Dean brothers on the playground and in the streets, but there was no sign that he was known until he was called to the blackboard one day in geometry, the only course in which he had not been sent to the kitchen. Then Chad saw Harry turn quickly when the professor called his name. Confused though he was for a moment, he gave his demonstration in his quaint speech with perfect clearness and without interruption from the professor, who gave the boy a keen look as he said quietly, "Very good, sir." And Harry could see his fingers tracing in his class book the figures that meant a perfect recitation. "How are you, Chad?" he said in the hallway afterward. "Howdy," said Chad, shaking the proffered hand. "I didn't know you grown so tall. Didn't you know me?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you speak to me?" "'Cause you didn't know me." Harry laughed. "Well, that isn't fair. See you again." "All right," said Chad. That very afternoon, Chad met Dan in a football game, an old-fashioned game in which there were 20 or 30 howling lads on each side, and nobody touched the ball except with his foot. Met him so violently that, clasped in each other's arms, they tumbled to the ground. "Let go," said Dan. "Suppose you let go," said Chad. As Dan started after the ball, he turned to look at Chad, and after the game, he went up to him. "Why, aren't you the boy who was sent out at Major Buford's once?" "Yes." Dan thrust out his hand and began to laugh. So did Chad, and each knew that the other was thinking of the tournament. "In college?" "Mathematics," said Chad. "I'm in the kitchen for the rest." "Oh," said Dan. "Where you living?" Chad pointed to the dormitory, and again Dan said, "Oh," in a way that made Chad flush, but added quickly, "You better play on our side tomorrow." Chad looked at his clothes. Football seemed pretty hard on clothes. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe." It was plain that neither of the boys was holding anything against Chad, but neither had asked the mountain lad to come to see him, an omission that was almost unforgivable, according to Chad's social ethics. So Chad went into his shell again, and while the three boys met often, no intimacy developed. Often he saw them with Margaret on the street, in a carriage, or walking with a laughing crowd of boys and girls, on the porticos of old houses or in the yards, and one night Chad saw through the wide-open door of a certain house on the corner of Mill and Market Streets a party going on, and Margaret all in white dancing, and he stood in the shade of the trees opposite with new pangs shooting through him, and went back to his room in desolate loneliness, but with a new grip on his resolution that his own day should yet come. Steadily the boy worked, forging his way slowly but surely toward the head of his class in the kitchen, and the schoolmaster helped him unwearingly. And it was a great help, mental and spiritual, to be near the stern Puritan who loved the boy as a brother and was ever ready to guide him with counsel and aid him with his studies. In time, the major went to the president to ask him about Chad, and that august dignitary spoke of the lad in a way that made the major, on his way through the campus, swish through the grass with his cane in great satisfaction. He always spoke of the boy now as his adopted son, and whenever it was possible, he came in to take Chad out home to spend Sunday with him. But, being a wise man and loving Chad's independence, he let the boy have his own way. He had bought the filly and would hold her, he said, until Chad could buy her back, and he would keep the old nag as a broodmare and would divide profits with Chad. To all of which the boy agreed. The question of the lad's birth was ignored between them, and the major rarely spoke to Chad of the Deans, who were living in town during the winter, nor questioned him about Dan or Harry or Margaret. But Chad had found out where the little girl went to church, and every Sunday, despite Caleb Hazel's protest, he would slip into the Episcopal church with a queer feeling, little Calvinist of the hills that he was, that it was not quite right for him even to enter that church, and he would watch the little girl come in with her family, and after the queer way of these foreigners, kneel first in prayer. And there, with soul uplifted by the dim, rich light and the peal of the organ, he would sit watching her, rising when she rose, watching the light from the windows on her shining hair and sweet, spirited face, watching her reverent little head bend in obedience to the name of the Master, though he kept his own held straight, for no popery like that was for him. Always, however, he would slip out before the service was quite over and never wait even to see her come out of the church. He was too proud for that, and anyhow it made him lonely to see the people greeting one another and chatting and going off home together when there was not a soul to speak to him. It was just one such Sunday that they came face to face for the first time. Chad had gone down the street after leaving the church, had changed his mind and was going back to his room. People were pouring from the church as he went by, but Chad did not even look across. A clatter rose behind him, and he turned to see a horse and rockaway coming at a gallop up the street, which was narrow. The driver, frightened though he was, had sense enough to pull his running horse away from the line of vehicles in front of the church so that the beast stumbled against the curbstone, crashing into a tree and dropped struggling to the gutter below, another line of vehicles waiting on the other side of the street. Like lightning, Chad leapt and landed full length on the horse's head and was tossed violently to and fro, but he held on until the animal lay still. "Unhitch the horse," he called sharply. "Well, that was pretty quick work for a boy," said a voice across the street that sounded familiar. And Chad looked across to see General Dean and Margaret watching him. The boy blushed furiously when his eyes met Margaret's, and he thought he saw her start slightly, but he lowered his eyes and hurried away. It was only a few days later that, going up from town toward the campus, he turned a corner and there was Margaret alone and moving slowly ahead of him. Hearing his steps, she turned her head to see who it was, but Chad kept his eyes on the ground and passed her without looking up. And thus he went on, although she was close behind him, across the street into the turnstile. As he was passing through, a voice rose behind him. "You aren't very polite, little boy." He turned quickly. Margaret had not gone around the corner. She too was coming through the campus, and there she stood, grave and demure, though her eyes were dancing. "My mama says a nice little boy always lets a little girl go first." "I didn't know you was coming through." Was coming through. Margaret made a little face as though to say, "Oh, dear." "I said I didn't know you were coming through this way." Margaret shook her head. "No," she said. "No, you didn't." "Well, that's what I meant to say." Chad was having a hard time with his English. He had snatched his cap from his head, had stepped back outside the stile, and was waiting to turn it for her. Margaret passed through and waited where the paths forked. "Are you going to the college?" she asked. "I was, but I ain't now, if you'll let me walk a piece with you." He was scarlet with confusion, a tribute that Chad rarely paid his kind. His way of talking was very funny, to be sure, but had she not heard her father say that the poor little chap had no chance in life, and Harry that someday he would be the best in his class? "Aren't you Chad?" "Yes, ain't you Margaret, Miss Margaret?" "Yes, I'm Margaret." She was pleased with the hesitant title and the boy's halting reverence. "And I called you a little gal." Margaret's laugh tinkled in merry remembrance. "And you wouldn't take my fish." "I can't bear to touch them." "I know," said Chad, remembering Melissa. They passed a boy who knew Chad, but not Margaret. The lad took off his hat, but Chad did not lift his. Then a boy and a girl, and when only the two girls spoke, The other boy lifted his hat, though he did not speak to Margaret. Still, Chad's hat was untouched, and when Margaret looked up, Chad's face was red with confusion again. But it never took the boy long to learn, and thereafter, during the walk, his hat came off unfailingly. Everyone looked at the two with some surprise, and Chad noticed that the little girl's chin was being lifted higher and higher. His intuition told him what the matter was, and when they reached the stile across the campus, and Chad saw a crowd of Margaret's friends coming down the street, he halted as if to turn back, but the little girl told him imperiously to come on. It was a strange escort for haughty Margaret, the country-looking boy in coarse homespun, but Margaret spoke cheerily to her friends and went on, looking up at Chad and talking to him as though he were the dearest friend she had on earth. At the edge of town, she suggested that they walk across a pasture and go back by another street, and not until they were passing through the woodland did Chad come to himself. "You know, I didn't recollect when you called me little boy." "Indeed? Not at first, I mean," stammered Chad. Margaret grew mock haughty, and Chad grew grave. He spoke very slowly and steadily. "I reckon I recollect everything that happened out there a sight better'n you. I ain't forgot nothing. Anything." The boy's sober, half-sullen tone made Margaret catch her breath with a sudden, vague alarm. Unconsciously, she quickened her pace, but already she was mistress of an art to which she was born, and she said lightly, "Now, that's much better." A piece of pasteboard dropped from Chad's jacket just then, and taking the little girl's cue to swerve from the point at issue, he picked it up and held it out for Margaret to read. It was the first copy of the placard which he had tied around Jack's neck when he sent him home, and it set Margaret to laughing and asking questions. Before he knew it, Chad was telling her about Jack and the mountains, how he had run away, about the Turners and about Melissa and coming down the river on a raft. All he had done and all he meant to do. And from looking at Chad now and then, Margaret finally kept her eyes fixed on his, and thus they stood when they reached the gate, while crows flew cawing over them and the air grew chill. "And did Jack go home?" Chad laughed. "No, he didn't. He come back, and I had to hide for 2 days. Then because he couldn't find me, he did go, thinking I had gone back to the mountains, too. He went to look for me." "Well, if he comes back again, I'll ask my papa to get them to let you keep Jack at college," said Margaret. Chad shook his head. "Then I'll keep you for him myself." "Then I'll keep him for you myself." The boy looked his gratitude but shook his head. "He won't stay." Margaret asked for the placard again as they moved down the street. "You've got it spelled wrong," she said, pointing to steal. Chad blushed. "I can't spell when I write," he said. "I can't even talk right." "But you'll learn," she said. "Will you help me?" "Yes." "Tell me when I say wrong things?" "Yes." "Where am I going to see you?" Margaret shook her head thoughtfully. Then the reason for her speaking first to Chad came out. "Papa and I saw you on Sunday, and Papa said you must be very strong as well as brave, and that you knew something about horses. Harry told us who you were when Papa described you, and then I remembered. Papa told Harry to bring you to see us, and you must come," she said decisively. They reached the turnstile at the campus again. "Have you had any more tournaments?" asked Margaret. "No," said Chad apprehensively. "Do you remember the last thing I said to you?" "I recollect that better'n anything," said Chad. "Well, I didn't hate you. I'm sorry I said that," she said gently. Chad looked very serious. "That's all right," he said. I saw you on Sunday, too." "Did you know me?" I reckon I did, and that wasn't the first time. Margaret's eyes were opening with surprise. I've been going to church every Sunday for nothing else but just to see you. And again his tone gave her vague alarm, but she asked, "Why didn't you speak to me?" They were nearing the turnstile across the campus now, and Chad did not answer. "Why didn't you speak to me?" Chad stopped suddenly, and Margaret looked quickly at him and saw that his face was scarlet. The little girl started on, and on her own face flamed. There was one thing she had forgotten, and even now she could not recall what it was, only that it was something terrible she must not know. Old Mammy's words when Dan was carried in senseless after the tournament. Frightened and helpless, she shrank toward the turnstile, but Chad did not wait. With his cap in his hand, he turned abruptly without a sound and strode away. End of chapter 15.